So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is a Mr. Media interview, broadcast and recorded live on blogtalkradio.com from the new media and baseball capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. I know a thing or two about comic book artist and American master Will Eisner and his best-known character, the Spirit. I spent almost 3 years researching and writing the only biography of the man, Will Eisner, A Spirited Life. And in the course of that, I spent a great deal of time with Will, in person and by phone. Because of that time, and what I think is fair to call intimate knowledge, I've been dreading the Frank Miller-directed movie, The Spirit, which opens on Christmas Day, December 25th. Will's attitude toward the many attempts at making a movie based on The Spirit was simple. He loved collecting the annual rights option checks, but hated the idea of anyone actually making a movie on his beloved character during his lifetime. He described the first effort, an ABC television movie of the week, as cardboard. And I don't think he would ever have approved Frank Miller as a director for The Spirit if it were up to him. Read the book Eisner Miller and see if you get the impression that he would want Frank doing the creative for his pride and joy. Anyway, I tell you all that as a way of introduction to tonight's guest, Stephen Paul Leiva. Several years ago, Steve worked with Brad Bird in the early stages of development for a Spirit animated film. Bird, of course, is best known for creating and directing The Incredibles and The Iron Giant, where if you look carefully, you'll see the Spirit comic. Unfortunately, I couldn't get an interview with Bird in time for my Eisner biography, so I never learned much about the never-finished Spirit animated film. Until early December 2008, that is, when Stephen Paul Leiva wrote about the project for the Los Angeles Times. It's a great story and fills in a major gap in the Eisner cinematic story. Steve, welcome to Mr.
Bob.
Media. Hey.
Thank you, Bob. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine. You're Mr. Media. Is there a Ms. Media or a Mrs. Media anywhere?
There is a Mrs. Media and there is a Ms. Media, and they're all family members, and they're the only ones welcome to use the registered trademark. Yes.
I'm happy to hear that.
Well, Steve, you electrified the Eisner and comics world in the last few weeks with your story about the Spirit animated film. Now, I can guess, but why come forward with the story now?
Oh, it was the coming out of the Frank Miller film. I was sitting around one day and probably reading a upcoming films thing, and I just said to myself, that's an odd pairing, Frank Miller and Will Eisner. And I saw a few trailers and I said, this just doesn't look right. I said, now might be the time to get the story about the Spirit movie that wasn't. So I said to my wife, "Do you think I ought to write this up?" She said, "Yeah." So I did, and it got on the LA Times blog.
What kind of reaction have you had since publishing the story?
Comments on the blog, and comments on Cartoon Brew, and emails from people, basically all saying, "How can I see that mock trailer?"
Yeah, I want to see it too.
Well, I don't have a copy of it anymore. If I did, buried away in storage somewhere, it'd probably be in Betamax. Which was the format. In fact, Gary Kurtz first told me, professionals watch beta only. He hated VHS. So my first machine was always a beta, and then of course, goodbye beta. As far as I know, if any copy exists, Brad probably has it. It was shot in, I believe, 16 millimeter, and I first saw it on film in 16. But I remember we also had tapes that we would take to people that not only had this mock reel, but a selection of projects to be done by the company we were going to form, Visions Animation and Film Works, including Family Dog was on that, and something I believe it was called Villains, and it was a bunch of, it obviously, as I remember back, may well have been the precursor of The Incredibles that finally happened. Were, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, please, finish your thought.
Oh, they were they were like proposals. They weren't animated. They were just a look-see at the designs and a narrator telling you a little bit about what they would be about. And I think it was probably Brad doing the narration.
So that's what I was just going to ask you, is what actually got done on the Spirit? I mean, how much? There was something that was being shown.
Well, this was the trailer that Brad, with the help of Jerry Reese and most animators, I believe, were all classmates of theirs from Cal Arts or from Disney. It was probably no longer than 3 minutes. It was cut like a movie trailer with a narrator. They had different animators, I believe, did the voices of Danny and the Spirit and Doland. And I think we even had the little kid in there, or they had, because this was made before I came into the picture.
Mm-hmm.
And it ended with the Spirit on top of an L train track with the train heading right towards him. And then, boom, the title, The Spirit, came up, just as supposedly the train hit the Spirit. So it was done beautifully, and it really caught your attention. And it was all full character animation. It was in pencil test. It wasn't colored. But I love pencil test animation. It's my favorite kind of animation because that's where you see the raw, real animation and movement. Well,
first let me give out our phone number. If you've got a question for Steve, give us a call at 646-595-3135. I know from the event page on Facebook, there were quite a few people who were very interested in what you had to say about this. So take us back to the beginning of this, and how does the story of your involvement in this project start?
Well, it was back in 1980. I had gotten involved in animation in about 75, 76. I had a film newspaper called the Cinema File that failed, unfortunately. But it was just a little tabloid that a buddy and I put together in a bedroom in Orange County. But it got the attention of people in Hollywood, and it got the attention of a man named Phil Chamberlain at the Motion Picture Academy, and he got me a job with the Animator Society called CIFA. And that got me deeply involved in animation. The president at the time was the lovely June Foray, who people might know as the voice of Rocky the Flying Squirrel. And that led to working at a film festival here in Los Angeles, programming animation. And I got deeper and deeper into the art form of animation. But I got frustrated because it was really in the doldrums back then, and I really wanted to see American animation mature. And in my mind, that meant going a little bit away from all the talking animal stuff and fairy tale stuff and all that, and getting a little more adult, for lack of a better word. And so after I left FilmX, I became a publicist. And what I did is I offered my services very cheaply to people like Chuck Jones and Bill Melendez and Richard Williams, basically so I could hang out at their studios and learn, which I did. And then I realized I needed to become a producer, and I started telling people I'm looking for projects. And then a buddy of mine who had worked at FilmX as well, we were at a screening. He said, "You got to see this pencil test I just shot." He was an animation camera guy. He had an animation camera service. He said, "You got to see this pencil test. These guys are really good." And I had been approached by a lot of people, and almost always their projects were the same old, same old. It was a fairy tale, it was a talking animal, whatever. And I said, "Yeah, okay." He said, "Come on, my service is right down the street." So after the screening, we went down, and he showed me this trailer, and it blew me away. And I said, "This is it. This is exactly what I want to be producing. Who are these guys? I got to meet them." And he put together a meeting, I think, for the next day. And it was Brad, and along with him came Jerry Reese, who had worked on it. And if people know Jerry, he later did The Brave Little Toaster. And
great movie.
Produced the animation for Space Jam with me. We were partners at the time in Reese Leiva Productions. And we had other projects that didn't necessarily get off the ground, but we had a lot of fun trying to get them there. Anyway, I looked at this stuff and I said, you guys are doing exactly what I think needs to be done. What can I do to help? And Brad said, "I want to pitch this to only 4 people: Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Francis Coppola or Gary Kurtz. And Gary Kurtz, if people don't know, had produced American Graffiti and the first 2 Star Wars. And as it happens, I had had some contact with Gary. He had come to a program I had produced at FilmX, that's the film festival, and I met him there and introduced myself. And I dealt with his assistant during the time I was doing publicity for Chuck because they wanted to open, in the premiere of Empire Strikes Back, they wanted to open with Duck Dodgers. Oh. And so we were, somehow I was a go-between on that, as I remember. I don't know if it actually happened because Duck Dodgers was Warner Brothers and Empire was 20th or what have you. And so I was able to get a hold of his assistant, Bunny Alsop, and say, I've got this project, blah, 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 the spirit and what have you. And she said, let me get back to you. What I didn't know then is she got these calls all the time and usually ignored them, but it turned out that Gary was a huge fan of Will Eisner and the spirit and comic books in general. And what I didn't know at the time, but later saw, is in his building up in Marin County, which is just north of San Francisco, he had built a fireproof, huge walk-in vault for his comics collection.
There's a fan.
That's how into it he was.
Wow.
So she eventually called back and said, Gary wants to buy the rights to the spirit and move forward. And that's kind of how it started.
Wow. Was there a meeting at some point with Will?
Yes. Before that, of course, I forgot to bring is the time we showed the reel to Gary, which was at George Lucas's old Los Angeles headquarters called the Egg Company, because they wouldn't put Lucasfilm on the building for fear of all the fans inundating them. It's across from Universal. But what happened is we had to, of course, secure the film rights, and Gary assigned his lawyers to it, as all producers do. They were moving a little bit slow, so I got myself involved to really push and became, again, sort of a go-between and contacted Will Eisner and eventually set up a meeting in New York because Will was, as I remember it, intrigued but reluctant. And he definitely wanted to see this animation. We told him about the trailer, and of course we weren't going to just send it to him. We wanted to be there at the time. So we arranged the meeting. Brad and I flew to New York. Gary, I think, was actually in London and flew to New York from London. And the first meeting was Brad and I taking a train out to White Plains, New York, meeting Will at his house, which was a lovely house in this neighborhood that was almost like in the middle of a forest. It was, and, I'm a Southern California boy. It was so romantic to me, very Cheever. And sat down with Will, showed him the trailer. I think he was very, very impressed by that. We talked about what we wanted to do. Brad talked about the kind of story he wanted to do. Will had maybe some minor criticisms of the trailer. I think they were almost all drawing issues. But he really liked it. And then the next day, I believe it was, we were going to meet with Gary for more business talks, and that we did in Manhattan at the Princeton Club, which Will was a member of.
Right.
And as I tell the story in the blog, the beautiful thing is we're standing out in front of the Princeton Club, Brad and I, waiting for Gary and Will to show up. And we're very young, we're very enthusiastic, we're gung-ho, we're meeting with Will Eisner, this thing's really going to happen. And suddenly this produce company truck pulls up, and the name of the company was B. Eisner. And, we took that as an omen. We took that as an order. Be Eisner. Don't be anybody else. Make it Will Eisner's the spirit. And what have you. So Brad said, go stand by the truck. And he grabbed my camera and he took a picture of me by the truck. But then we went into the Princeton Club and had a lovely lunch and a lovely discussion with Will.
I was going to say, that picture of you in front of the truck is on the LA Times blog site.
Yeah.
And if you're listening, you can, in the live web chat that accompanies the Mr. Media interviews, I have posted the link to that story. But you can find it. You can probably find it by typing in the spirit, but you can put in Steve's name too, and the story will come up.
If you Google Stephen Paul Leiva and Brad Bird, it's coming up right off the bat.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah,
So you went in and you met with Eisner. Now Brad is known to be a big fan of Eisner. Was this was he pretty moved by meeting the guy?
Yeah, I think so. Brad, I wouldn't call it hero worship. Because Brad was, in a sort of a fawning way. That certainly wasn't Brad. Brad at that point, I don't know if he would have considered himself on the same level. He could draw as well as Eisner. But Brad, knew what a talent he was. As I've always said, if someone is a genius, they're probably smart enough to know it. And Brad definitely knew where his talents lied and what he could do, and he was very confident of doing a good job. But he was thrilled that this was happening, and he was thrilled to meet Eisner, and he was determined to, and I think he was also honest with him and said, this is still cinema, this is still film, it may be slightly different, but we won't do anything without involving you. Mm-hmm. And we may even, it's been years since I've read the contract, but I'm sure we probably had Eisner on in a consultancy position of some sort. He probably would have demanded it. Eisner was a businessman, as you know, having written his autobiography, his biography.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it wouldn't be. Eisner was a businessman. He was a smart guy. He kept control of his characters. So he always asked tough business questions. And the contract negotiations, they weren't hard, but they were detailed. And he really, knew what he wanted. And we, successfully concluded the contracts because we did get the film option. So everything must have worked out well. Again, it's been years. I don't remember the details. But I just remember being kind of being in the middle between Eisner and our lawyers, making sure our lawyers understood how important it was that we accommodate Eisner's need to have some creative control. We couldn't give him 100%. No Hollywood studio would ever do that. You just can't. Mm-hmm. But once he met Brad and, kind of caught Brad's demeanor and Brad's passion, I think he understood what Brad could pull off. So he pretty much got behind it. Later came to Los Angeles, too. I don't really remember. We must have had a series of meetings. That's where he met Jerry Reese, because I remember picking up Will from the airport, I believe, and meeting Jerry for dinner. And on the way, Will was fascinated by supermarkets, large California supermarkets. So we had to stop so he could go into a big supermarket, because I guess they didn't have them in White Plains, New York. But he walked the aisles of this big Safeway or whatever supermarket it was. I think it was on Santa Monica Boulevard. And he was just fascinated by it.
I'm laughing because I'm sure that one of the things he had to look at there was probably the grapefruit. That was his big thing. Was he loved to have fresh grapefruit, and part of the attraction of Florida for him was that he finally, when I spent time with him, he had finally planted his own grapefruit tree so he could have his own grapefruit. So I'm sure being in California,
wonderful.
that was a big thing. I was gonna mention I've actually opened up the biography here, and there's a listing here of some of the well-known Hollywood figures who had been involved with Spirit movie projects, and this is before the current one. William Friedkin, who did The Exorcist. Gary Kurtz, of course, we talked about. Michael Uslan, who bought the current rights with Ben Melniker through Bat Film Productions, and they had the rights for years and years and years. But also, Jules Pfeiffer wrote a script for a Spirit film that was rejected. Newspaper columnist Pete Hamill wrote a script. Writer Harlan Ellison wrote a script, and Will himself wrote a script at some point. So to add, to officially add, Brad's involvement in this is, pretty amazing company that this character has attracted.
Well, it was an amazing piece of work, wasn't it? I mean, when you figure when it came out in the 40s, compare Will's artwork, compare his layouts, compare everything to the early Supermans. And I'm a big fan of Superman. I have Superman things all over the bloody place here. But the early Superman books are primitive looking. Will was a heck of a draftsman and could draw, but he understood getting into the panel. And he was cinematic, and I think he was inspired by film to the different camera angles or whatever you want to call it in the graphic novel. And, of course, he essentially created the whole form. So he was a genius. And that was the beauty of this project, is putting the young geniuses that Brad and Jerry were going to gather around them, headed up by Brad, of course, and take a work like that and transfer it to the big screen in a way that would have blown people away because, you know, they were watching Care Bear movies at the time or second-rate Disney, as Disney was in its transition period. And it totally would have flown into the face of what everybody expected animation to be. I can't tell you how many times people would quote to me about animation, don't do in animation what you can do just as well in live action. And this was one of the big bugaboos, you know, well, the Spirit should be done in live action. And and we rejected that, and Brad rejected that. And basically what we were trying to say is you don't do with animation how you would do it in live action. And, of course, everything's changed now because of CGI and all the special effects. Even in live action, there's nothing you can't do. So the point is if you love the form of creating movement sequentially, frame by frame, whether it be hand-drawn or whether it be in the computer, there's a certain control and there's a certain artistry to that that's different than live action. It's more akin to ballet. It's more akin to dance. But it's definitely a performance art. And if you love that, you want to tell a whole range of stories. So we felt the Spirit would come out and just blow people away and show an ability to animation that no one had seen before, except in a few short films from either Europe or up in Canada. Carolyn Leaf's The Street, let's say, or Anna and Bella, films like that dealt with more mature matter. And, you know, we weren't making a deeply esoteric film. It's the Spirit. It was going to be an action-adventure film. But it would have been done in a way, it would have been done the way films are being done now. And, of course, Brad eventually got his chance in both Iron Giant and Incredibles. And everything that he put in those films, he was talking about then. He knew damn well what he wanted to do back then. He wasn't on the learning curve. He had it.
Now, Steve, how long was this movie in development with you guys? How long did you have the option and the rights?
We probably had the rights for 3 or 4 years. What happened is this started in 1980. By 1982, and what had happened is he got Gary at first got the rights, and then I convinced Gary to get Brad started on the screenplay. Brad was, I think, working on Plague Dogs at the time and miserable, if I remember, because the guy running Plague Dogs, Martin something or other, who wasn't really an animator, but he was quote-unquote directing the film, because it was dogs and realistic, he felt the movement had to be quote-unquote realistic, which, of course, was stiff. He didn't want stretch and wash. He didn't want exaggeration, not understanding that through those techniques is where you get to truth. Not reality, but truth, and truth is more important. So Brad was miserable working on this film up in San Francisco, and, of course, Gary was located up there. So I finally convinced Gary. I said, we need to get started on the screenplay, and so he, out of his own pocket, started to pay for the screenplay to have Brad start working on it. And it was, and Jerry Reese contributed a lot story-wise, I believe, and I think eventually was going to share a story credit with Brad on it. But it was a great screenplay, as I remember.
You're driving us crazy saying that.
So well, I'll tell you, I'll try to remember a few details, but I've been struggling to remember because it's been, 25, 26 years since I've read it. But by 92, Gary had, we later got Jerry onto the project as well. I wasn't on the project yet myself. I was still struggling doing some publicity and, trying to feed myself. But by 92, or 82, Gary had gotten involved with Tokyo Movie Shinsha in Japan on the Little Nemo project based on the Winds of McKay. There's another great strip artist who was a fine draftsman. They had gotten the rights. It was actually, Little Nemo was PD, I think, in America, but in some European countries, the rights were still being held, and Tokyo Movie Shinji got them. And it was the great love of the head of that particular Japanese company. And I had actually first met them when I was with Chuck Jones, because they had come to Chuck Jones. They knew they wanted an American animator involved. And it was through Chuck Jones that he had me introduce them to Ray Bradbury, who later worked on the film with us. But Chuck didn't work out. And I'd forgotten all about it, and suddenly Gary tells me I'm doing this film, Little Nemo, with the Japanese. I said, yeah, I know about that. He says, well, why don't you come on board as the associate producer and be an animation development guy for my company? And I said, okay, because I was near starving. It sounded like a pretty good idea. So I got involved in that, which meant setting up a studio in Los Angeles for development with the Japanese for a year, and then moving to Japan for a year in '83. Now, when we moved to Japan, the development on the script was done, and that's about the time the script was all done, production art was being done, and Gary was out trying to sell it. And then I went to Japan, and we could never sell it. Hollywood just couldn't see it. We had one offer, I believe, to make it into a live-action film, which all of us absolutely disagreed, and I believe we couldn't, because I believe our contract with Will specified that it had to be an animated film. And we only got the animation rights. Of course, if the studio wanted to make it big enough, they just would have renegotiated with Will, but that wasn't our purpose. Now, the script, I'm just trying, I remember flashes. I think we had the scene on the L. Everybody knows what I mean when I'm talking about the elevated train.
Right.
And there was a huge action sequence in sewers. The octopus is never seen except for the gloved hand, as in the comic strip.
Wait a minute. Wait. I got to stop you there. The octopus was never seen except for his hands? You mean he wasn't a tall, popular black actor?
Not, were there any then? I'm sorry. No, that's not, I'm sorry, that's horrible. This is Sidney Poitier.
I don't think, clearly Brad was not using his imagination enough.
You're
anyway,
right.
Go ahead.
It was funny, because Brad is funny. It had action. There was romance with Ellen. I believe Sans Serif was probably the villainous. And of course, Inspector Dolan was involved in the whole kit and caboodle. I don't remember what the evil plot was, but it had something to do with the sewers.
Okay. What about Ebony? Was Ebony in the script?
Yes, Ebony was. Thank you. I couldn't remember the name. How could I forget that name? Ebony was definitely in the script. We were at the beginnings of political correctness, but we didn't care. We didn't feel that Eisner had ever handled that character in a demeaning way. He was a heroic little kid, especially in this script, as I remember. Mm-hmm. And I think Brad paid close attention to making sure that Ebony came off really, really well. Mm-hmm. He wouldn't have had, I'm sure, vocally. We never did a voice track, but vocally he wouldn't have had a kind of a silly step-and-fetch-it voice or anything like that. Probably his design was pulled back a little bit, as I remember. You got to remember when Eisner was first drawing him, which was the 1940s, and all Negro characters had thick lips, et cetera, et cetera. Brad probably designed that back a little bit, but not in an unrecognizable way, as I remember. Integrity, I think, is a key word here. Brad was determined to keep the integrity of the original work, and then plussing it on the big screen in cinema, and then putting his own genius into it. That's as I recall.
Yeah, no, that's very
I'm
helpful.
assuming I'm correct,
Well,
but it would have been exceedingly exciting, and the great color artwork that I believe Jerry did several big pastel pieces that were beautiful. And then Jerry was doing a lot of boarding up in Marin County. Gary had bought an old schoolhouse and had it totally refurbished, beautiful woodwork, as I remember. And his company, Kinetographics, he had left Lucasfilm at this point. Kinetographics was based out of there, and then he rented office space to some other people. But they had nice big rooms, Brad and Jerry, working on this project, and also doing some preliminary stuff on future stuff for Visions Animation and Filmworks, which was a company that the four of us were all going to be partners in. But the Spirit not happening, and me going off to Japan, and then Nemo, and Gary and I eventually left the Nemo project because the two sides, the Japanese and American sides, weren't really coming together on what that film should be. Creative differences, as they say. But you also had cultural differences, which were rather large. Nonetheless, had a great time living there for a year. And Brad, we did take Family Dog to Spielberg. I remember a meeting at Spielberg. God, it may have been at the Egg Company again. I remember sitting down and Brad showing some updated storyboards to Spielberg, and he was starting to help fund it. And then eventually it wound up. If you know what I'm talking about when I say Family Dog, correct?
I've heard the name, but I don't know that much about the background of the story.
This was a short film about. Well, again, this was the genius of Brad. It was a story of a dog, but it was a real dog. It wasn't a talking dog. In a family, and the funny things that go on with it. There was one. It was meant to be a short. Eventually, it became an episode of Spielberg's Amazing Stories.
Oh.
And Brad did more stories. There was like 3 separate episodes, I believe, with the dog. And the first one being exactly what he boarded out, and I remember him showing to Spielberg in a meeting that I was in, and that was also on the proposal reel with the Spirit mock trailer. And it's what got Brad the job as a creative consultant on The Simpsons, because again, it was sophisticated, it was funny. The dog was a real dog, a real family dog, not a talking dog, but it's full of personality, and everybody else was human on 2 legs. Not anthropomorphic, but real live Homo sapien type human people, and funny as hell. So if you ever, there's an episode of Amazing Stories. I don't know if Amazing Stories have ever been sent to DVD, but if you can ever get the VHS of that particular episode, you should check it out. But a lot of the tone was later what was happening with The Simpsons. So I think, in fact, I could be totally misremembering here, but I think when they were setting it up at Fox, and Fox was worried about whether this is doable, this kind of animation on TV, the only one who had ever done it was Brad Bird, and that's how they got him involved, I think, as a creative consultant. And he was, like, for 10 years or so involved with that.
So when the end of the option for the Spirit came, did it die quietly, or because so much time had passed? Was there much regret, or?
I think so, because again, while I was in Japan, the whole thing sort of broke apart, and Brad went off on his own. Jerry went off on his own. When I came back from Japan, it was all over, and I quit not only the production, but I quit Kinetic Graphics because I told Gary that that we weren't getting anywhere in Japan, and I said, I'm losing all my contacts in Hollywood, and I feel the need to get home, and this is just frustrating because they won't listen to you. On this project, do you know of Miyazaki, the great Japanese animator?
Yeah, of course.
Well, Miyazaki was the Japanese co-director, and then we had an American co-director at first. But Miyazaki was determined to make the film he wanted to make, and he didn't, quite frankly, particularly like the gaijin, the foreigners on it. Now, Miyazaki's another genius. And the head of Tokyo Movie, Shinsha, probably shouldn't have been asking him to do something that was against his own integrity. And so eventually Miyazaki was let go while we were still there. And while we were still there, twiddling our thumbs trying to come up with a story, he completed a complete movie on his own, which was the Nausicaa movie, which we went to while we were still there and watched it in Japanese. And there's a caricature of Gary Kurtz in it. We're sitting there in Shinjuku in Tokyo watching this, and suddenly this character walks up, and it's a spitting image of Gary Kurtz, who at that time had a like a Quaker beard.
Wow.
He is a Quaker, I believe, but a beard with no mustache.
Right.
And then Miyazaki went on, of course, to become, quote unquote, the Walt Disney of Japan, which I think is an insult to Miyazaki. Actually, he's his own. He's his own genius. He doesn't have to be anything of Japan. And I was happy to see that. I have a little caricature of me drawn by Miyazaki somewhere in storage, because the Japanese kept trying to get me to eat sushi. And I just turned to him and I said, look, I have a philosophy. The only thing that should eat a raw fish is another raw fish, which they found to be fairly amusing. So he drew this picture of me looking at a raw fish and sweating from my brows. And somewhere in storage I have that. I luckily found the drawing that Brad did of me, and we were able to put that on the blog site.
I see that. Yeah, I'm looking at that now. That's you in kind of the Spirit's suit,
Yeah, I'm not tall like the Spirit, shall we put it. Neither is Brad, for that matter. In fact, Brad and Jerry and I were all about the same size. But yeah, he drew that as we were flying home late at night from New York. And the comment, the character's making a comment, on the whole, I'd rather be doing Sondheim, because at the time I really wanted to do Company, a Sondheim play in animation, and had actually approached Stephen Sondheim, who turned me down.
Oh.
But that's where I wanted to go with animation. It was pretty radical. Yeah, so I thought Company would have made a great animated film.
So you guys had the rights for 3 or 4 years. So you start in 80. So around 83, 84, the rights revert back to Will. Will sells them again, which he did a lot of. And did you ever see the ABC TV film?
The Sam Jones?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a TV movie. It obviously wasn't brilliant. It brought a tear to my eye, knowing what could have been, and it was not only live action, it was on TV. And I thought Will's creation deserved a hell of a lot better than that. It needed to be splashed on the big screen. And they were probably, as I remember, it's been years, they probably were slightly camp. Because were they still having... Yeah, most movies, ever since Batman with Adam West, they couldn't do a superhero thing without being camp, because the Hollywoodites felt that's the only way to do it and be sophisticated. And they didn't know what they were doing. And of course, our Spirit would not have been camp. Would have been funny in places, but it definitely, most assuredly, would not have been camp or handled that way. No more so than The Incredibles later turned out to be. And now, of course, we have Batman movies that are being considered for Academy Awards.
Yeah, it's in the same year that the Spirit film, the Frank Miller Spirit film, is being reviewed as potentially the worst movie of all time. So it's quite a contrast. I want to read you a quote. This is I'm going back to Spirited Life, the book, but Frank von Zernick, who was a producer of the Spirit TV movie, said, I had asked him what went wrong with that, and he said, and this will just take a second, but he said, Eisner's work required a particular edge and darkness. What was tricky was trying to remain true to his vision in terms of the depiction of the characters without doing a cartoon. That's hard to do with sets and wardrobe. You must spend a lot of time refining that so the piece has a distinctive look. The Spirit wasn't Batman, but a very interesting character nonetheless. Television just wasn't ready for him. Personally, it was disappointing. I thought the material was unique. When you're passionate about something, you get it made, you lick your wounds, and move on. And then the one thing I want to add, this is what Will Eisner said when I asked him what he thought of the final edited version of that TV movie. It made my toes curl, he said. Just awful. It's cardboard. So, and I have to say that von Zernick and Paul Arito, who worked on the film, and Steven Souza, who I believe wrote the film, they were all great and were willing to be interviewed, and they took their lumps, And I don't read any of that or refer to any of that to be brutal to them. They were very kind, and it was a different era and a different time. But that happened like within 3 or 4 years of the rights passing from you guys. So I'm sure that in looking at that, you had to be like, oh my God, if only things had worked out better.
Yeah, I think that as I remember from the TV movie, the only thing I thought they got right was a certain angle on that sort of grill top to his underground lair with the light coming in. You know what I'm talking about? The big round. And there was one angle that they shot that I said, well, that's Eisner. But again, I haven't seen it since probably the day it was on television.
Wow.
But it was sad. It was sad, and not only because of Eisner's work, but again, from our perspective, what the release of our spirit would have done for the whole industry of animation and the art. And as I indicated in my essay, is it would have changed. I think would have changed a lot of careers. Hollywood would have discovered Brad a lot earlier than it did, which could have ruined them. Who knows? Things like that happen. But I don't think so. Jerry Reed probably would have done more than he's done.
Steve, did you hear from Brad after you wrote the story, or from Gary, or any of these guys?
No, I haven't. We all went our separate ways, except Gary and I came back together and were partners on a couple projects shortly after this. Projects that I created. There was a live-action animated project that I had created and created a character for, an animated bird. I know I was talking about humans, but the live-action people were humans. But this was to be hopefully a crazy funny, and I had Paul Bartel involved for a while, if you remember Paul. He did Raoul.
Of course, and Mary.
And then Jerry went off, of course, and did Brave Little Toaster, and I lost touch with him, and then we ran into each other in a theater just before Brave Little Toaster was being released. And we got back together and got very friendly. And then for 2 years, I was president of Chuck Jones Productions, which is a company I formed with Chuck in 1990. After Little Mermaid came out in 89, everybody wanted to do animation. And Chuck was being approached again, and they were trying to use his name to raise money. And I said to him, Chuck, why don't you use your name to raise money? Let's see what we can do. So for 2 years, we had a production company. But he was really wasn't that interested in it expanding. I was hoping to use it as a base to bring in the young talent. And it didn't really work out. We did do a 7-minute animated segment in a not very memorable John Ritter comedy called Stay Tuned.
Wait a minute. I like that movie. I know that movie.
The only music got was our 7-minute segment that I produced.
I actually that was the movie, as I recall, where he got like trapped in a TV set, right? And he got
trapped in the Devil's cable network cable. And kept going from station to. It was a clever idea. In fact, I just ran across the screenwriters a couple of weeks ago. They've got a children's book out now called The Rune Warriors, or The Rune Warrior. Tom Parker and Jim Genuine. It was their first screenplay sell. They're great guys, wonderful guys.
That movie was. It was like there was another John Ritter movie. John Ritter, it's funny, we all know him from TV, and not many people actually saw his movies, but the movies that he made were all very, very oddly done. They were all had some quirk to them. Stay Tuned. I remember Americathon, which he starred in with Meatloaf, and there was was it Hero at Large, where he played like a I think he played like superhero at.
Kind of thing. I don't think I've seen that one. But he was a hell of a talent,
Yeah.
And he was. I worked with him just one day when we recorded this 7-minute segment. He and Pam Dauber, and the director Peter Hyams was willing to take their first take on everything. And luckily, I and Jeff DeGrandis, who was kind of co-directing with Chuck, really handling a lot of it. Was up there, and we said, "No, Peter, please, we got to animate this stuff. We need some light." And so Pam Dauber and John Ritter gave us a lot, and we had a lot of fun with them that day, and enjoyed doing that. But after I left Chuck Jones, I got Jerry involved in the project that Gary and I were trying to do, and eventually, Gary took it to Alan Ladd at MGM, and we sold it. And Jerry, I had written a screenplay, and actually, at this point, I said to Jerry, if you want to rewrite the screenplay and make it your own, let's do that. So we sold that, and then shortly thereafter got involved with Richard Zanuck and Dick Fleischer, the son of Dave Fleischer. Max Fleischer, I guess, was his uncle, in doing a new Betty Boop feature. Yeah. And we sold that to MGM. And unfortunately, we get started on that, and 3 months later, Alan Ladd Jr. loses his job, and they canceled the film. Story of my life. But that would have been a fun film. And Jerry had written the script for that. Jerry wrote the script. He and I were producing, and we brought in a young man named Steve Moore to direct. That would have been a fun film. And we were completely, when we got started, we were going off the script. And by the time they pulled the plug, we were 75% boarded. I had studios lined up in England to help us on the project in a kind of a protection technique that Steve Moore had come up with. And it would have been a fun film. We had great music by a jazz musician named Benny Wallace, who I'm using on. I'm doing this thing for Strike TV. I don't know if you've heard of Strike TV, but if you don't know about it, you should.
This came out of
the Writers Guild strike, and it's a platform for guild members to create their own product and continue to own them. And it's getting a lot of play. And I've just done a thing called the Old Curmudgeon's Book of Questions. And for my theme music, I'm using some music from Benny Wallace, great American jazz musician that is well known in Europe, not as well known here, but he's really a key talent. But Betty Boop got put on hiatus. So Jerry and I eventually wound up producing the animation for Space Jam, and wrote a screenplay for Columbia and did some other things. But he's now working, I think, for a company in San Francisco. And I finally left animation, in essence, because I had started out as a writer, got totally enamored with animation, really passionate, like a monk wanting to spread the word, or a priest or somebody. But I couldn't draw. I couldn't be an animator. The only thing I can draw is blood on occasion. And so it wasn't my art form, and I finally said, well, I have to get back to writing. And since then, I've published a couple novels, had a play, premiered at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in Scotland. Keep trying to ply my craft doing that.
Well, and I wanted to, before we wrapped up, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your book. And even as we're doing this, I am posting a link. So if you're in the web chat, or if you're listening to this later, you can order Steve's book, Blood is Pretty. When did that come out?
Blood is Pretty came out in 2003. And it's talking about the spirit. I have a character I call the Fixer, and he works in Hollywood. He's a fixer, except, this is over-the-top sort of a thing. He's really kind of inspired by, well, I used to call it you remember The Player, the Robert Altman film and the Michael Tolkien book?
Sure. That's the movie with the longest tracking shot in history.
Exactly, and a player is a guy in Hollywood who's a mover and shaker. So I call it The Player Meets the Saint as introduced by James Bond. So that's sort of what The Fixer is, and it's action adventure thriller, takes place in Hollywood, and I'm able to make some pointed comments about the industry that way. But that was a fun book to do, and
I know you also have the 12 Dogs of Christmas, because it's just about Christmas, I think we ought to mention.
Well, that is a novelization, which is a little independent film that a buddy of mine made. I wrote the original treatment for, and then when he raised the money for it, I was unavailable to do the screenplay, and the director did the screenplay, which, altered a bit from my original treatment, of course. That's the way it happened. But then later... And the movie itself was based on my friend's It was actually Ken Cragen, who's very well known. Remember We Are the World and Hands Across America?
Yeah, wasn't he Kenny? He was Kenny Rogers'
manager, and Trisha Yearwood and the Smothers Brothers and Lionel Richie and all that. His daughter had written this. She'd taken the 12 Days of Christmas and rewrote the lyrics at the age of 7 as the 12 Dogs of Christmas, where dogs are the gifts. And that got published and has now sold maybe 600,000 copies.
Wow.
And someone at Sony said, God, you should turn this into a film. And so Ken called me, so I wrote a treatment, and we were just about to sell it to Sony as an animated film when Sony fired a lot of people. This is Hollywood, folks. But later, he showed it to another friend who's a live-action director, and he turned it into a live-action film. Okay. And it's been marketed, it was short life as a theatrical, marketed as a DVD, has done very well as a DVD. And then the publisher of the original book came back and said, why don't you do a novelization of the movie? So Ken turned to me, and I novelized the movie, which was one of the few times that anyone got to novelize a movie after the movie was made. Usually you do it from a script and not the final shooting script. So it was fascinating to watch the movie and then describe it and add to it. And there were certain things about the movie that I felt was lacking, and I was able to, put it in there, lacking because of editorial problems or time or what have you, not necessarily because of creativity. And I was able to, put those things back there and expand upon. And that was fun. It was a fun thing to do. And then there's an organization called the International Media Tie-In Writers, which is a great group of people who write novelizations and Star Wars books and Star Trek novels and all that. And they have an award called the Scribe Award. And this year at Comic-Con, I picked up the Scribe Award for the best YA adapted novel.
Wow,
so
congratulations.
That was fun.
That's great.
So that's out there, too. That's at Amazon. And, it's Christmas time. It's a good book to buy.
Well, Steve, let me tell folks that they can learn a little more about Steve and Paul. Is it Leiva?
It's Leiva.
Leiva.
Just like a Hawaiian lei with a va at the end.
Okay, Steve and Paul Leiva.
Hawaiian lei in a good way,
Well, I don't know. Well, anyway, I'll let that go. Check out his website. It's www.Steven, S-T-E-V-E-N, Paul, P-A-U-L, Leiva. Wait a minute. No, I just did it wrong. Leiva.
There you go.
Leiva.com. That's all solid. StephenPaulLeiva.com. And you can order either of his books that we just discussed, Blood is Pretty or 12 Dogs of Christmas, on Amazon.com or at MR Media, MrMedia.com. Steve, I so appreciate that you wrote this story for the LA Times about the Spirit animated film that could have been, and that you came on today and shared it with us. As I say, as someone, it meant a lot to me to get that piece of the Eisner story added to the legend.
Well, hopefully maybe you'll be able to do a second edition of the biography, and you're welcome to plug some of the information in.
I appreciate that. And thank you so much for joining us on Mr. Media today. And, we'll keep an eye out for more projects from you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I enjoyed myself.
Thanks, Steve. Good to have you here. And happy holidays.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. And, folks, for more movie-related interviews with actors, directors, producers, and screenwriters, surf over to our main website, www.mrmedia.com. That's where you can listen to my earlier conversations with The Spirit and The Dark Knight executive producer Michael Uslan, actors Kirk Douglas, Billy Bob Thornton, Ali Sheedy, and Bob Balaban, and many, many more. Please think about writing an online review of Mr. Media, casting a vote for Mr. Media, or marking Mr. Media as one of your favorites, whether you listen on Blog Talk Radio, Pointer Online, Digital Journal, Podcast Pickle, Vox, Folio, Mediafly, Podfeed.net, Blueberry, Zencast, Odeo, the Kindle Reader, or iTunes. And if you've got an idea for a guest, email me directly at bob@andelman, ANDELMAN.com. Thanks so much for joining us today. I always appreciate when you give up a little piece of your day to spend it with us.